This is not a very religiously couched talk, but it's also a little bit about me and how I came here and what this place has done to me, both during the time I was here at Madison and since. I came to Madison actually from Baltimore in September of '67, and I came as a postulant of Bishop Harry Lee Dahl in the Diocese of Maryland. Postulancy in those days was so much easier than it is today. It was a discernment process where we simply sat down with the bishop and your rector and the decision was made. And I'm sure we had a lot of bad priests because it was so simple in those days. The discernment process is much more difficult, obviously, and a lot more checks and balances and whatever. But I'll tell you, I chose the University of Wisconsin a little bit too late in order to get a very good dorm selection. That was the last year that you actually had to live in a dorm if you were a freshman. And I was relegated to a dorm called Elm Drive C. When I went out to see it, last time I was here about a month and a half ago, the building's there, but it's not a residence hall. I'm not sure what it's being used for these days, but anyway, it was the farthest away from campus as you possibly get. And my first class in my freshman year was in Science Hall, which was a good half-hour walk away. I'll tell you, I remember December 15th, 1967, I decided to go out shopping for a Christmas present for my mother, and I went to what I think is Hilldale, is that right? And it was 15 degrees. The reason why I remember December 15th being 15 degrees, and I had never, ever felt cold like that. I have since, many times, especially in Chicago, which is where I am now. But anyway, I was an Episcopalian. I attended services at St. Francis House in my freshman year, but it was merely just sort of attending Mass and evensong, singing the Missa Marialis and whatever else. Father Abel was the chaplain at that time. Father Claude Thompson was the assisting priest. He was from, I love to say these words, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And they were fine people, but for me, not too memorable in that first year. And I will tell you then that later in that semester, my second semester when I was here, Professor Herb Howe, who was a member of this congregation, St. Francis House, as well as the chairman of my department, walked into my, I was in an office, and two of us were there with the instructor, and we were reading Hesiod, believe it or not. And he walked into that office as if there were 500 people in it. It was a tiny office on the 9th floor of Van Nuys, and he goes like this. Anybody here want to go to Rome next semester? Does that sound like him? That's exactly him. And I raised my hand. So I was not here in Madison for the first semester of my sophomore year. But when I came back penniless. And I was having some difficulties with my mother, who wanted to claim me as an exemption on her income tax form, which meant I could not get any financial aid from the university at all, either in scholarship or student loans. So I stayed out that second semester of my sophomore year and lived with my roommate from Elm Drive C, actually, in an apartment that he had gotten. But what happened was in the summer, the fall, I stayed in Madison the rest of my life, actually, until I left in 1974. And I came to St. Francis House and I learned that there was a vacancy over the summer months. Summer wasn't much. It was mostly transients that were coming through the house between the spring semester and the fall semester. And I was one of those transients. And when the fall semester did arrive, Father Art Lloyd came back from vacation and was kind of surprised to see me there because he hadn't been involved in actually my actually being there, because he had already left, I think, for vacation, I'm sure it was. He usually vacationed in Wellfleet, I think, all the time. And so he interrogated me and did an inquiry, as it were, and accepted me to live in the house, which was nice. And I lived there for a couple of years.
What years?
That would have been the summer of '69 I started, and then he was there in the fall. He had already started previous to that. Let's see, let me look at my notes here. Okay, so what I wrote was essentially that I was thankful that he accepted me, and my relationship started with him, with St. Francis House, living out peace and justice and the gospel within the Episcopal Church, with revised liturgy that led to the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. I suppose we're all doing that in the late 70s, and it appears that we might have to be doing this again in the near future. But anyway, I was involved with washing bathrooms, where I found out that the ladies are not quite as clean as the men, and cleaning the lounge, and with taking part in a cooking co-op. We had a co-op where there were 4 or 5 of us who belonged, I think, and one of us would cook dinner for the night, and another person would clean up, and that just rotated on a basis. And we had a great deal of fun making all different kinds of dishes. It was the beginning of Father Lloyd's chaplaincy, where house fellows, there were only men at that time, were assisting the chaplain by engaging in the program ministry of the Episcopal Student Center. Up until that time, it was more like a fraternity house that I know of. I mean, it was that way when I was in my freshman year. And good camaraderie, and basically all the house fellows did was clean in return for room. This was really kind of an exciting time. It was actually I wrote a wonderfully joyful and sometimes quite depressing time for all of us. The reason, of course, that was depressing was because there was so much going on in the world that was not too happy. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. We were in the height of the Vietnam War, the Cambodia invasion in 1970. And there were seemingly endless strikes on campus. I have no idea how we got any studying done whatsoever. There was a Black Studies strike that culminated in the Afro-American Studies program at the university here. There was a TA strike for better pay and better conditions for TAs. There was Lyndon Johnson resigning. I can remember exactly where I was when that happened. And the election twice, God forgive us, of Richard Nixon. And of course there were campus demonstrations, one right after the other, especially surrounding the events of the Vietnam War. The economics building in my freshman year was the site of demonstrations and sit-ins because Dow Chemical at that time was making a chemical weapon called napalm that disfigured human faces and body parts. And it was a huge demonstration. And this was brand new to me. I'd never experienced or seen anything like this. I was just trying to get from one end of the campus to the other. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people surrounding the economics buildings. Is there still an economics building today, across from the social science building? Yeah. Anyway, what was happening was Dow Chemical was trying to recruit to their for work, and there were people who were objecting to their presence on campus. During the Cambodian campaign, there were widespread demonstrations and violence. Besides campus police, the city's police force was here. The National Guard was employed. I don't know if you've seen any of these pictures from that era, where a girl goes up and puts a daisy down a rifle of a National Guardsman. I'm not sure there were tanks here. There may have been. I can't remember. But there was certainly National Guard, military with police. There was tear gas, there was mace, and there were billy clubs, and the billy clubs were swinging. And not an insignificant amount of blood and threats flowed. So what would St. Francis's response be to this? And how do we live out the gospel in the midst of all this going on? It was at least threefold, I would say. During the summer of '69, when I didn't think I was going to be able to get a student exemption because I dropped out of college for that semester, I made several visits to a house on Langdon Street where the American Friends Service Committee had its headquarters. My thought was to obtain CO status, conscientious objection status, an exemption from military service. And in the midst of all that was going on, the AFC office explained to me, this guy named Scott Herrick, who was very instrumental in a lot of people's lives and part of the AFSC, said they had to close down their operation, the Friends Committee, in the midst of all this was going on because of lack of funds. So I went back to Father Lloyd, and I suggested that we start up and carry forward the work of the Friends in one of our basement classrooms. So we started the Madison Draft Counseling and Information Center, MDCIC, and we received an enormous amount of help from an organization called the Midwest Center for Draft Counseling. It was centered in Chicago, and they were part of a national organization of activist lawyers, and so we did quite a professional job, I think, and we only took donations for that. And we had a lot of people from the congregation, as well as outside the congregation, who rotated on a regular basis in offering their help to people who came to us. An aside, I guess I should tell you, I told Art this, and I think he's repeated it, but is one of the people I counseled, I didn't realize until later, was a guy named Leo Burt, who was part of the Carlton Armstrong group that blew up the Army Math Research Center. And the only thing he wanted to know was about how to get to Canada. This was before the bombing, and I didn't realize until afterwards, oh my God, and I'm looking at the picture of him in the paper, of course. And we didn't do much with counseling people on Canada. We were really mainly interested in helping people through conscientious objector status and obtaining that. But it was kind of scary to think of that, actually. I saw him again later, before the bombing again. It was in the cafeteria line at the Wisconsin Union, and we talked a little bit. So we did a lot in that regard. Second, Dave Belts, who was a pre-med student and living at St. Francis House, and not so coincidentally, he was a dorm mate of mine from Elm Drive C. He went to Father Lloyd and suggested we set up an emergency first aid station in the house during demonstrations to take care of students who had been hurt, either with billy clubs or gas or whatever. I could still see on the front door of this place this huge red cross, so people knew this was a safe place to come and get help. Poor Dave, he died actually several years ago. He had become a had a popular family practice in Neenah, Menasha area, and he left his wife and young children. It was a sudden heart attack. Very painful for me and for all his friends. And I think probably the most important thing that we did, and Art Lloyd pushed so much, was offering hospitality, because there were lots of places, including religious centers, who were not offering hospitality. People would come, organizations would come and want to meet together in a single place, and they were being turned out. The main organization, there were many meetings of something called MAPAC that Father Lloyd and Sue Lloyd and lots of other people who were at Father Lloyd's funeral last month, called Madison Area Peace Action Coalition. And what's interesting about that is Richard Nixon used to say all these peace action coalitions are filled with communists. And believe it or not, he was right. They were young Trotskyite communists, but then there were students who were very fervent in their beliefs, and there was always a fight between that group and sort of the more general left liberal peace activists of the day. And they met in this room, and I can still see it. Week after week, they would come in and try to organize activities, demonstrations, marches, parades, whatever. We did one of our own as well in response to what was going on. We had an exorcism, where we had a casket, and there were about a dozen or so, or maybe more, a couple dozen maybe, that took the casket around with a thurifer, and I was the thurifer with a thurible, and we would go to these different places on campus that we considered evil, whether it was the Army Math Research Center itself or other places, that were not living out the gospel, I guess, in our judgment. But and there was a movie made of that, a lot of stuff that was going on in Madison at the time. It was called The War at Home. I can get it probably either Netflix or Amazon these days. I think Father Melton has looked at a bit of it. It's very rough footage, as I recall. But it was of the time in the 1970s. And there is actually part of it has us with his casket, Father Lloyd, myself, Steve Spicer, who can't be here today, who were doing this kind of demonstration. I personally was actually in a demonstration myself as part of the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, and whatever we tried to stop an induction bus that was leaving from the Badger bus depot and was going to Milwaukee. And we sat in front of the bus and were dragged away. And eventually, we were all put in county jail for 6 weeks. And it was a long time to do that, but there's a beautiful picture of the Cap Times of 3 of us: Fred Kreutziger, who was a priest at the Catholic Center, myself, and Jim Struve, who was head of another place called the Center for Conflict Resolution. Exciting days they were, I'll tell you. I've taken up way too much of your time. I wanted to say that my experience at St. Francis House has never left me. It was campus ministry that where I got over my doubts, where I quit that postulancy process. And it was a spiritual home for me. And I continued on my spiritual journey after that. I'm now a very active member at Church of the Ascension in Chicago, on Anglo-Catholic parish on LaSalle Street. And I have served on the board of Brent House for a few years, which is, as you probably know, the Episcopal Ministry for the University of Chicago. And I felt kind of guilty. I didn't have much relationship with St. Francis House in those days. This is, I think, before your time, Father. And I was donating money to Brent House. I felt like I should be donating it to St. Francis House. So eventually I did. I don't know if you remember that or not. But and at Church of Ascension, by the way, was interesting. I met Peter Monkmeyer there. It was just by coincidence. It was amazing. I'm standing in the back of the church, the narthex, and in walks Peter. I don't think I recognized his face, but his voice I knew right away.
That's my Midwest accent.
Yeah. Well, one other thing I'd say, we had a reunion here about a year ago this time, and again, most of us did not recognize each other. It was people from the same era, 40 years later, and we didn't recognize each other's faces, but as soon as one of us spoke, it was unmistakable. Our voice and our mannerisms and our likes and dislikes don't seem to change over the years. Maybe they should. Anyway, that was living out the gospel at 1001 University Avenue in those days. So thank you very much for hearing.